Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the April 20th, 2010 special meeting of the Glendale City Council. And the business at hand is a budget study session. This is our second, and we'll be focusing on the CIP. May we have the roll call, please?
Council members Draymond.
Here.
Friedman.
Here.
Quintero.
Here.
Weaver.
Here.
Mayor Najarian.
Here. Thank you. Mr. Starbird.
Good morning, Mr. Mayor, members of the City Council. This is budget study session number 2 in what will be a series of budget study sessions, putting together the operating and capital budgets for the upcoming fiscal year 2010-11. Today, our focus is going to be on the capital improvement program, specifically the general fund, what we call the general fund capital improvement programs. As we'll note in the presentation, there are a number of different capital improvement programs, streets, redevelopment, and the likes. Those will be focused on at a different time. This one is just the general, or as we call it, general fund capital improvement program. Some prefatory comments, and then I'll turn to Bob Elliott to give you the relatively brief PowerPoint presentation. Like the discussion of the general fund operating budget that you had at your last study session, very little has actually changed in the budget you'll see here today for the upcoming year. As we think back to where we were when you were putting together the budget for 2009-10, not much has changed. We still find ourselves in the throes of the economic downturn that's having a considerable impact on both our operating and our capital budget. The state still continues to wrestle with its budget crisis, which, as we know, presents a number of threats to both our operating as well as our capital budget. At the beginning of the year, you might recall that the tax increment bond market was pretty well frozen, so a number of considerable projects that we had planned in this year's CIP we had to either place on hold or find alternate means of funding in order to have them proceed until we saw a lightening in the bond market, which occurred shortly after the first of the year. Unfortunately, we were able to go to market in the February-March timeframe, and you'll see in the CIP the projects that were stalled for most of the fiscal year are in a position to get underway with the funding from the GRA bonds. But that is probably the most considerable source of funding in the CIP, a budget that is a mere shadow of its former self of 10 or 12 years ago and continues to face challenges in finding an ongoing means of resources to support capital needs. With that, we will focus at the end of the presentation on what I think are some long-term strategies that we need to consider as we get into this next year's and years beyond, looking for ways to commit resources to the capital improvement program so we can begin to address the needs for both rehabilitating existing facilities as well as building new facilities to meet the needs of the community. And we'll touch on those toward the end of Bob's presentation. With that, let me turn to Bob Elliott, Director of Finance. Bob.
Good morning, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. As Jim stated, we're talking mainly CIP today. Wanted to give a brief overview of what we're going to go through is touching on the CIP funds that we have throughout the city, give a little bit overview of, as Jim mentioned, on the GRA funded projects that are on tap for this year. Excuse me, and then we'll talk in detail more on the general fund CIP and some of the other significant ongoing CIP projects that are already in the pipeline. And then we'll briefly touch on some long-term strategies that we'd like to start a discussion on. There's no recommended action items at this point, but just food for thought at this point, and then we'll review the study session schedule again. As Jim mentioned, the focus today is on the general fund CIP, which is our Fund 401. But a lot of the other specific funds that the city has, notably transit, gas tax, and parking, all have specific CIP or capital improvement projects within those funds themselves, funded by those revenue sources. And while we've listed out some of those today, those will be reviewed during subsequent study sessions when we review the non-general fund operations. As the last slide showed, some of the special revenues, this slide highlights some of the enterprise funds that we have and some of the capital improvement projects that those funds have pretty much on an ongoing basis, and we'll touch on those during subsequent sessions. As Jim stated, the We were able to issue redevelopment increment bonds this year. Those bonds netted the city $24.65 million. They will be repaid with redevelopment tax increment. Those are funding projects within or adjacent to the project area. And just as we had programmed earlier, the Adult Recreation Center, although more than this, it gets $7 million. The East Brand connection to the ARC is $4.5 million. Columbus Soccer Field, 3.2, and the Central Library renovation, almost $10 million. So focusing on the general fund CIP, we want to give a brief overview of where we're at in terms of the funding summary of the fund in total. Our estimated fund balance for this year, 9/10, is just over $300,000, $374,000. And you'll notice in the resource area, and if you recall from past years, there were significant additional revenue resources that were put into the CIP fund and subsequently transferred out. So part of our effort this year was simplifying the CIP. One big difference you'll notice is the lack of sales tax dollars that we have suggested to council to put into the general fund for operating purposes. That was 4% of the sales tax, approximately $1.2 million that we are not putting in there for this coming year. The bulk of the revenue now is the Shoal Canyon royalty fee generated obviously by Shoal Canyon. Some of the AB 1600 mitigation fees of approximately $1 million for next year, and then some of the grants that we've received from the state. That gives us about $5 million in resources for 10-11. And as we'll go through, there's about $2.8 million in requested appropriations, and I'll show you that in a minute. Another payment that comes out of the CIP is the earthquake retrofit lease payment that we did for this building that we're in. That goes through fiscal year 13-14, so we have a couple more large payments on that, and then that will conclude. All being told, that will give us about $1 million fund balance in the Fund 401 towards the end of this year. So that's pretty much the scaled down resources picture for this year. Whoops.
Don't the, Mr. Elliott, back to that slide, just so I'm clear. When you say Shoal Canyon royalty fee, is that regarding, pertaining to the golf course, the gas royalties, the, what exactly is that?
I have to turn to public work. There's two. There's the host fee and the royalty fee derived from Shoal Canyon, and all that.
Mr. Mayor, the Shoal Canyon this portion is actually the tipping fee, so it's based on the tonnage that's disposed at the landfill.
Okay.
We receive approximately $4 million per year. We put $1.5 million off to the side for post-closure.
Okay.
And this is what's remaining.
All right. And then 3 lines down, when you go to the grant receivables, Pacific Pool, wouldn't that also be an expenditure? Or we're holding that until the
yeah, it will be
expended?
Yeah, it will be. But that's the state grant that we're receiving for the pool.
Okay.
You're seeing it on the resources side of the budget, so
Okay.
it's coming in.
And so it's not an expenditure yet because there's no actual expenditure yet, next year or the year after, perhaps?
Correct. Yeah, and you'll see that, and we'll go through the
Okay.
detail.
Yeah, it will be reflected in the capital project on the expenditure side of the budget. Let me note, maybe going back to that slide again before we move on, in one of the last slides we're going to touch on strategies for, long-term strategies for finding more reliable resources to go into the CIP. I'm anticipating this year and next year, assuming our strategies for balancing the operating budget are successful, and if we keep the hiring freeze that we've had in place last year and this year, it's very likely we will end the year like we did last year with savings in the general fund operating budget. If that's the case, I propose that we essentially give back the $1.1 million that we're taking this year in the sales tax that was to be transferred in the CIP, and we've pulled over to support the operating costs. In that way, although we can't budget for that in the upcoming year, I'm anticipating either at the end of this year or the end of next year, we'll likely generate at least $1.1 million in savings to the general fund. And as a result, that should probably be one of the first priorities to restore in the CIP, is that flow of sales tax revenues back into the capital improvement fund.
Okay.
And it's very likely we'll have that savings at the end of the year.
And also, when we talk about our park impact fees, et cetera, is that something that's part of our CIP resources, or is
Right.
that a...
Right. But again, it has to go for projects that are eligible for use of those fees. And then you'll see the projects, but we've included that as a resource. On a project-by-project basis, our estimates are based on what we anticipate in the upcoming year, those projects that are reach a point at which they're obligated to make those payments.
Okay, thank you.
Some of the specific projects that we wanted to highlight, we talked about some of the library projects, the Central Library project, already in the pipeline and with prior year appropriation. The Brand Library had $5 million in prior years. Part of the $2.8 million that we just spoke about for 10-11, $1.5 million is dedicated for the Brand Library, and then another $1.5 million in future years for a total of $8 million planned for that project. Pacific Pool is a little bit more complicated because there's a relatively interesting mix of revenues. The $1.4 million that was on the front page which is the state grant, also has CDBG funds, but part of that's in another fund. The total appropriated thus far is $6.1 million for the Pacific Park Pool. And then there's a scattering of other...
For a total cost, the Pacific Park Pool
is $6.1 million.
is the total? Okay, great.
And if, as you have questions, any of the execs are here. George can answer anything on the park projects, or Cindy, I take it on the... Correct, within that. That, George.
Sure. Good morning, council members. Part of that budget also includes $970,000 from mitigation impact fees from one of the projects.
Right. So the resources you saw earlier about park and library impact fees, this project draws on a piece of that, a piece of those resources.
In some of the other categories that we wanted to highlight that are already in the pipeline or set up as projects is the Fire Station 29 reconstruction. That's slated to start in 11-12, and it's about $4.9 million. And some of the other Fire Station 26 and the training center, $500,000 respectively. The larger projects within CIP that are already in progress under Public Works is the State Route 134 flyover. That's $31 million. The I-5 Western Interchange is $12 million. And then some of the other street projects and remodel jobs that they have going with the old police department and some of the other repairs that they have throughout the city. Parks, there's a lot of projects ongoing.
We should touch for a second on Public Works and their street projects. As you know, beginning 2 years ago, as the state began to really come to grips with its budget crisis, it has threatened to take gas tax revenues each year. Gas tax revenues are the lion's share of the resources that we utilize for our various street projects, street maintenance projects. Most of these projects are not out of gas tax, but most of the basic street repair, street reconstruction comes out of gas tax revenues. Those programs were highly subsidized by general fund resources in previous years, and we've continued to draw away from that to support operations. But as I noted in last year's budget, Public Works has a considerable reserve in the gas tax fund. As of the end of 2009, they could allocate upwards of $16.5 to $17 million. They have about an $18 million fund balance, but there's some payables in there as of the end of the fiscal year. So they have a supplemental. They have a reserve that they can utilize to supplement the state gas tax resources, and with that, work to maintain the same level of street maintenance and street construction from gas tax that we've had in prior years. At least 3 years of supplement we could utilize the fund reserves for, and likely longer than that, because it takes them quite a while to really spend a whole year's allocation of both the former general fund and gas tax resources. But we do continue to face the threat by the state every year now. This year it was fended off. They didn't take gas tax, but they did do this swap and shift where I don't even know if you can call it gas tax anymore. I think it's more of a fee. But in all likelihood, as they come to grips with the upcoming year's budget and realize they are even further behind in closing their gap, I think that will again be threatened. And that is the lion's share of support that we have for our street maintenance program. So we need to watch that very closely. I'm still comfortable that if that isn't taken, we can maintain the previous levels of street repair and street construction that we have in the past for at least the next several years. But that's another challenge in our CIP, is to find ongoing resources to adequately support our street maintenance needs.
Question? The $31 million for the flyover project, is that all out of our CIP, or I thought there was
So that's actually state grant funded.
Okay, so that's all shown in
Right.
here.
The state grant money comes into the CIP, and this is where it gets
I
budgeted.
Thank you.
In fact, most of these major projects you see on here are all state or federal grant funded.
At some point, if we do this again, or when we do this again, it would be good to have that separated out also for us to
Sure
see.
can do that easily.
Where's the Measure R money that we're got and will be getting, half a million or so? Is that shown as a resource?
We've gotten one payment on Measure R. Yeah,
Separate
we
fund.
set up a separate fund for it.
Okay.
But as yet, haven't had any activities yet, program for it.
Okay.
Going on to the parks, we just want to highlight a lot of the park projects that are underway or when they're planned to take place. Obviously, ARC, we noted that before, $7 million coming from the grant or the GRA bond proceeds. The total project is almost $11.3 million, and that's well underway. Other projects that are ongoing, the Maple Park project, the Freeway Parkside A was programmed in 2014-15 for $3.5 million. The Columbus soccer field was also included within the GRA bond proceeds, and that's $3.2 million. Other projects that are on the plan to be started in future years is the Verdugo Park renovations there, Rock Haven rehab for $1.2 million, the Maryland Mini Park, $1 million, Duke Majan Barn, $1 million, Fremont Park, Cedar Park tennis courts, and Babe Herman all have hundreds of thousands appropriated or planned for those in future years.
Bob, explain what we mean by in progress. They're currently underway.
Those are currently underway, and to what extent, I'd have to turn to George in terms of what the progress is.
Sure. The Adult Recreation Center is almost complete, should be
But
done by...
that means those funds are available and work is currently underway
Yes,
on those.
Maryland Mini Park, that's in progress, but we have a state grant. We're applying for a state grant for the Maryland Mini Park. Duke Majan Barn, that's $1 million grant from the Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy. We've bid that out. We may have to do that in phases and apply for more money for that as well. Freeway Side A, we're in the EIR process for the 2 soccer fields in Freeway Side A, as well as Columbus Soccer Field. I think we have a community meeting next week for the EIR process.
Where are we on the 2 soccer fields at the freeway?
We're working with planning for the environmental impact.
They're doing the environmental. We funded the environmental in the early years and the capital for the project in later years.
Right. Any other questions?
Thank you.
Moving away from parks and on to the library, we've discussed a few of these already. The Central Park renovation, the total amount for that at this point is $10.6 million. Roughly $10 million of that's coming from the redevelopment bond. The brand library renovation, of $8 million. Next year, or 11-12, the $2.8 million is planned for the Montrose Branch Library, and and some of the other ongoing repairs for Casa Verdugo and the Glendale storefront library. As we mentioned earlier, some of the long-term funding strategies that we wanted to at least throw out for discussion purposes with council, a typical strategy in a number of cities is allocating surplus, and Jim spoke to that a little bit. At the end of the year, if the general fund does end up with a surplus, common policy is devoting 50% of that surplus back to the capital projects fund, which is a somewhat of a supply, not necessarily ongoing or measurable. Really depends on what the year ends up, but it is a strategy to get some revenue into the capital projects fund. Additionally, in 2016, when the redevelopment project area starts shutting down, the central project area can start repaying the general fund part of the $60 million loan. That's a potential funding source for the capital projects fund. When the project area is shut down in 2025, there will be property tax from that project area that will come back to the general tax area, to the general fund property tax revenue. That's a potential way off. And as Jim mentioned, some of the potential strategies for developing Shoal Canyon landfill with the expansion of the landfill, thus increasing the volume of fees, and potential gas recovery or other strategies that could utilize the landfill, whether it be mining or other technologies that may come about.
Bob, how much have our, I call it host fees, the royalties, how much have they fallen off with the downturn in the economy?
Oh, quite a bit. The host fee, we had originally programmed at $2.8 million for this year, and we've reduced that down to $2.2. And the same thing with the royalty fee was $4 million, and we've reduced that down to $3.5, and now down to $2.5.
So as the economy comes back, landfill activity will increase because there's more, especially more construction and commercial activity. So we'll see those royalties increase as the economy comes back automatically. Time frame is unknown, but we're beginning to get signs, interest by development firms who want to talk about their properties now, anticipating in the next 2 or 3 years they want to have product online. So I think we're going to start to see activity pick up, barring something on a global nature from occurring, like China having a real estate meltdown. If that occurs, it may throw us back into a downturn. But barring something like that, at least we're seeing signs that there is a development interest, and with that, you begin to see more activity at the landfill.
And the last strategy that we put up there was just really food for thought, was contribution from GWP via the transfer. That is a very sensitive subject, but that is a potential source for ongoing CIP within the general fund.
We should note before we leave this that the $1.1 million this year that we've incorporated into the general fund, in the 5-year projection for the CIP, we anticipate that returning to the CIP. So we've looked at that in the general fund and the CIP as a 1-year usage, and anticipate restoring it beginning in 11-12, the year after the upcoming year. And as I noted, to the extent we have savings in the general fund at the end of this year or next year, and I expect we will, we can look at that as one of the first priorities for reestablishing the loss in this upcoming year's budget for the CIP.
And with that, we just wanted to touch on the study session schedule. Again, next week we're going to start the department presentations for the non-general fund funds. Department heads will review those various funds under their management, and then we'll wrap that up in another study session, number 4, a date which we do not have at this point. And then on May 18th, we'll do the wrap-up with the general fund, and then we'll also present the redevelopment and housing budgets at those meetings. And then, again, we'll have the hearing slated for the 15th and the adoption on the 22nd of June. And with that, we're open for any questions.
Let me add, as I noted in the beginning, admittedly, this is not a very exciting CIP, either presentation or discussion, because the CIP really hasn't changed from what was presented to you last year. We're kind of trying to hold our own, keep the existing projects moving forward. hoping if there's some break in the upcoming year, we'll see more resources, but we haven't programmed those for new projects. It's really been a program of maintaining what we have underway, keep those projects moving. The biggest change is the ability to have issued the GRA bonds, and with that, those projects moving forward. With that, we'd be happy to answer any questions or take any direction from you.
Okay, I have some cards. Why don't we hear the speakers first, and then we can discuss it amongst the council. First speaker is Herbert Milano, followed by Mike Mohill. Seeing as we're doing pretty good with time,
You have 5 minutes?
would you like 5 minutes? Yes, 5 is okay.
Mayor Najarian, members of the City Council and City staff, my name is Herbert Milano. I was wondering if out of this presentation you had a good grasp of what has transpired with the capital improvement funds for the last 10 years. One of the things that you will notice, if you'll take a look at the CAFR on page 17, if you had it, you'll see the number of transfers that had occurred overall every single year. But one of the things that I would like to see, and hopefully you'll get to receive this kind of information, is the total amount of transfers that have come out of the capital improvement into the general fund for the past 10, 11 years. These tens of millions of dollars that basically have been taken out of capital improvement and into the general fund. But that's not all. There used to be a time when the sales tax revenues used to come in, I think, 50% towards capital improvement. And that was changed in 2004. I think it went 84 or 86% to 14%, something along those lines, and then only 14% went to capital improvement. So this is not a transfer. This is money that doesn't even get recognized. It's the money that should have gone into capital improvement. And then it went down to 4%, and now it's zero. So all of these monies, I think they should be accumulated and say, look, let's add them all up. And the money that should have gone into capital improvement, the money that was taken out of capital improvement into the general fund, and look at the impact that it actually has had. If you have to have your CAFR in front of you on page 169, I think it shows the number, for example, of street reconstruction miles. And this is a nice report because it contains from 2006 to 2009. And I'm going to give you the number of miles reconstructed. 2.9 miles in 2006, 0.8 miles in 2007, 0.9 miles in 2008, 0.13 miles reconstructed in 2009. And I can walk you from California and Kenwood and walk the street all the way to Central, and you will see the deterioration firsthand, the huge potholes. And in this report, basically on the statistical section, you see the impact that it has had, that lack of basic infrastructure needs. Now, I brought a PowerPoint basically showing what has occurred during this past 10 years with regard to payroll and benefits. Basically, they have gone from $112 million to over $220 million. We had a 72% increase. There's never any shortage. I think that the way the budget is done is first we'll take care of payroll and benefits. No matter what the increases are, there's never any reduction. But when it comes to capital improvements, it's whatever is left over. And you heard it today. You heard it from them today. It's basically saying, if we happen to have a surplus in the general fund, then we'll see what we can actually move into capital improvements. We used to have a report for many years, until about 2 years ago, which was the budget summary. The budget summary was a really nice executive-type report. It told you what salaries and benefits were, what the maintenance and operations were, the M&O, and its capital improvements, department by department, which was a nice overall overview. Now, imagine having that report and seeing it year to year in the same chart. So you could actually see the trend of how capital improvements went department by department. This will give you an overall trend view of what is taking place with the overall budget. The problem with these presentations is that they give it to you by fund. It's like saying, okay, we're going to look at the general fund. But the problem is that we have so many other funds that impact a particular department. So if you take the police, you have the general fund, and you got special service funds, and you got special revenue funds. And if you were to look at your budget, it's all spread out. You don't see it in a nice consolidated way as when we had it in the budget summary. And you need that. You need a bird's eye view by department with the capital improvements in each section, and then hopefully get a drill down on each one and see the trends. The trend is that capital improvements for those basic needs of the city have generally been put on the back burner. And this is no exaggeration. The numbers are there. You have available some PDFs that I brought for you. I won't have the time to show it to you. But it basically shows you the actual trends that has occurred with the budget. My suggestion is don't take a look at just the general fund or what's being given to you piecemeal. You need to take out the overall trends of what is taking place. And if you're going to look at capital improvements, look at it department by department. From the library department year after year, for the Parks and Rec year after year, for the police department year after year, and see what is truly taking place. But what is also missing is a deficiency with regard to the needs, the backlog of work that needs to be done. Do you have that in front of you? What is the actual backlog of road reconstruction that the city needs today? And all the other things that you don't see that are below street level. That's what you need to start basically getting a sense of how much should you budget in the future, what is the backlog of things that were not funded all these past 10 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Mohill, will you give me one moment to go into the back room and return? 30 seconds. I don't want to miss any of your pearls of wisdom that come forward, so just a moment.
We can only do this one or two at a time.
Mr. Moore.
Good morning, Mayor Najarian and council members. First, I'd like to talk about some good news, the Americana. My wife came home last night from work, and she says, Mike, one of the workers at our site here said he went to this fantastic place in Glendale over the weekend. She says, really? Which one? She says, I went to that place across the street from the Galleria called the Americana. Did you like it? She says, man, he says, it's the most spectacular thing I've ever seen. He said, I got on the phone, I kept calling all my friends, come over here to Glendale, look at the Americana. Okay, having said that, some good news. Mr. Starbird said last time that everything was on the budget, everything was open for this budget. Well, let's talk about the salary of Mr. Starbird. $251,000 a year plus benefits. City population is just over 200,000. And then we go over to the city of Long Beach. Population, double. And that city manager only makes $235,000. Why is that? Is it? They have more things going on in Long Beach, the port city, than we have little old Glendale. And that city manager makes nothing compared to our city manager. Why is that? A lot of people in the public would like to know why our city manager, Mr. Starbird, has a golden parachute and a golden everything. Disgusting. I'm sorry the word. $251,000. I'm living on Social Security. The man from Long Beach only makes $235,000, and his responsibility is almost 500,000 population. That's double Glendale. Okay, next item. Looking at the capital improvement, why is it? I see we have Rockhaven $1.2 million and Duke-Majan Barn $1 million. Why can't we take that money and transfer it to fix the roads in Glendale, like Central Avenue, like Verdugo Road, like Glendale Avenue? Can't we put that off? That's nice to have to those parks, but when people go into the city of Glendale and see all the broken roads, they say, hey, what kind of a city is this? They're falling apart. Speaking about falling apart, Daily News. The potholes in the city of LA, okay, they're pretty bad. But the last time I asked the city to do a comparison between LA and us, or our claims against the city, all the city council people would say is, well, we have We know we do better than them. And I said, well, really? I said, if you go over to the city clerk's office or the city attorney's office, they don't keep any records of comparison between Glendale and Los Angeles or Glendale and Pasadena or any of the other cities. So when someone on the council says here, compare us to other cities, we're doing a better job. Well, I've gone to the city clerk's office and said, hey, where can you show me a record between Glendale and Pasadena, Glendale and Burbank, Glendale and L.A.? And you know what? They tell me, we don't keep those records. Those are feel-good records. We must, Mr. Starber said we're doing a good job. And I'm saying, really? What are you comparing us to? You have records that I don't have? Last item, Shoal Canyon. I hope that dump site never fills up as far as I'm concerned. I don't care if it takes forever, because you know why? Because the sooner that dump site fills up, that means that my trash and you people will all be gone. We're going out to the desert, and I'll be paying 3 times as Mrs. Friedman. It's going to be in trains moved out. The landfill is only good for maybe 10 years. And then we have to think of something else. So if we're not getting in the revenues, thank you for one of the side effects of the recession is construction is down. It's true. But also the benefit is that the landfill is not filling up. And I hope we do not have LA bring their garbage here or anybody else. We discussed this last year. I was told the city was losing about $200,000 a year from the dump site. Guess what? I'm happy. Because in the years from now, the citizens of Glendale are going to be having our dump sent out to the desert. We're going to have the same problem that LA has. Not in my backyard, a dump site. Thank you for your time and consideration.
I hope you do, but I hope you plan on attending the city council meeting this evening, and some of your particular concerns may be addressed on the dump issue.
Well, Mr. Starbird said last night, everything's on and we're talking about the budget, and this is all about the budget.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I have no more speakers. Mr. Weaver.
A couple of comments. And I don't mean to speak for any of my colleagues, but I've studied the city budgets for about 20 years now. When I started running for council was 1992. And I went and purchased the budgets. I spent a long time with the finance director over the years to understand it. And having been elected since 97, firsthand I've seen what we do with budgets. A lot of what we do with budgets is based on the policy set by the majority of this council. And while Public Works can adequately and very correctly tell you what the state of all the roads in Glendale are and the backlog on doing that, this council or previous councils have had to weigh the good and the general fund base against improving streets. We upped the amount by $3-4 million a few years ago to get more into the streets. But based on the economy and what we see in the general fund, we haven't chosen to put improving the streets, which are far better than LA streets to begin with, above what we have to do in the general fund. On Mr. Starbird's salary, a year or two ago, I had a list over 100 city managers in the state of California. I gave a copy to Mr. Starbird because I was astonished to find the majority of the city managers in the state of California make more than Mr. Starbird. When you selectively pick out 3, 4, 5 and say, wowee, look how much money our city manager is getting paid, that is an unfair comparison. Some cities that have 50 to 100,000 people are paying over $300,000 to their city manager. Try to figure it out. How can they afford to do it? Oh, don't shake your head, mister. You took Vanguard, the same ones that are on Vanguard. You didn't look at the 100 that I looked at. So you don't know. You're just selectively picking, which is done quite often with you speakers. Pick what fits your attack. That doesn't hold weight. And And if you want to know how we're doing compared to other cities, read the paper. Read the Times, read the daily news, and you will find out the problems that LA has, which are significant and growing, and you'll find out about Burbank and Pasadena that have their financial problems much worse than ours. All you have to do is read. We don't need a chart showing comparisons, which would be very arbitrary, because how could you compare apples and apples for sure when you're comparing other cities? What do you put into it? So, I didn't hear much on the CIP today that it would change my mind on what we're doing in a tough economy. Thank you.
Thank you. Other comments? I have a question for Mr. Starbird, or is it Mr. Goldfinger? And the one point I want to raise is that someone brought up the city of Long Beach. Long Beach is a different form of city government than we currently have. They do have a strong mayor, weak
No, I
city
don't think
manager.
so. I think they're city manager form of government.
They are city
Comparable to
managers.
us, yeah.
Nine council members.
Comparable to us, yeah. Council districts, larger council, but a city manager form of government.
Perhaps the council members, I think it's full-time, though. I think they're paid a full-time salary.
I don't know about that.
And
I don't know.
are more involved in the process.
That would be them calling now.
The other point I'd like to raise, and hopefully we can get some discussion in it, is I think the important slide here is slide 11, the long-term strategies. And, we're very proud of the fact that we are balancing our budget. The problem is we are taking it from certain funds that historically had been funded and have given us some of the things that make a good city become a better city. The roads, the facilities, parks, pools, playgrounds, soccer fields, etc. I spent some time in the city of Santa Clarita, and they've got a capital improvement project plan that's just gangbusters. They're building huge roads through their city, athletic facilities, expanding their infrastructure incredibly. And I just wonder how they're able to do it. Surely they're feeling the same sort of downturn that we are in sales tax revenues. Maybe they're even harder hit with some of their expanding real estate developments that have come to a grinding halt. So I would like to discuss and perhaps get some historical background as to how, let's look from the years pre-2000 or pre-2003. How were we funding the CIP? And is there any chance of us returning to that level of funding where we could, keep the infrastructure up, but not just maintain what we have, also increase the services and the amenities that we provide the residents? Is there an answer that? Would you blame this? Would you blame our current situation on the downturn economy for the past 3-4 years, or would you blame it on retirement benefits?
Well,
let's put it in perspective and see, how much each of those is costing us. And there was a time when Larry Zarian was telling me, we put 50% of our sales tax into the CIP. What was different then that is changed today?
well,
I'd love that luxury. Speaking as a councilman, I would love to have a much larger flow of resources into the CIP where we can discuss, do we want to put a pool in, or soccer fields, or how many pools and how many tens of miles of roads will we upgrade, and et cetera. We don't have that luxury.
Mr. Mayor? Starbird, didn't we purchase a lot of land in the last few years, open space?
well,
Millions and millions?
when I came to Glendale 12 years ago, the complaints from staff throughout the organization was the city's policy of placing what they said was 50% of their sales tax revenues in the CIP. That wasn't actually what was occurring, because we found out as we began to tear that apart, you were actually charging a great amount of ongoing operating costs then into the CIP. But the concern back then was we had little money for programs and services. We were capital rich and program poor. And Dave will recall, back in my early days, my conversation with the council needs, rather than following these strict historical parameters of thou shalt always put 50% of sales tax revenues into the CIP, and then try to find more ways of loading more of your costs into the CIP, in effect creating a facade. The council just needed to be straight up about its policies relative to programming and services and capital needs. And there's a need in both areas for which there will always be more need than resources. But rather than having, as in the case of the CIP, and I went back and researched, because nobody could tell me when was it and why was it that we put 50% of our sales tax revenues into the CIP. It went back to 1954, when the Bradley-Byrne Sales Tax Act came into existence, and Glendale found itself with a considerable increase in its allocation of sales tax revenues. And it said then, the council said then, well, we're doing okay on operating, so let's load that money into the CIP. And that became the mantra here for decades following that. And as a result, we found, at least what was the view in the organization, and frankly by many outside the organization, we were capital rich and program poor. Services suffered, but we had lots of money to build new facilities that we frankly couldn't afford to maintain and operate. And my encouragement to the council was, it needs to be a balance of what you feel the priorities need to be. And you recall a conversation back when we were wanting to increase the size of the police department, when you wanted to purchase open space, when we wanted to expand hours at the library, the need to take on the paramedic program. All of those things improve services and increase costs in the operating budget. The difficulty we've faced over the years, and the difficulty you face, is that historically, city councils have made decisions about how we fund the city that can't be changed. They go on forever. You can't change them today. And so this city is cast in a predicament where many communities have more resources because they made decisions that frankly weren't quite as conservative as Glendale's. Other communities had higher taxing effort prior to the passage of Proposition 13. Glendale always prided itself on low taxes. So when Prop 13 passed, what happened? We got a relatively low share of the property taxes. Both of our neighboring communities got a much greater share of the property taxes, and that has gone on for decades. And we will never change that. It will probably never be changed for cities, at least in our lifetime. It's been tried in the past. It's failed. So if we were just equal in property tax revenues with our neighboring communities, that would be $8, $9, $10 million a year difference in our resources. Following the passage of Proposition 13, many communities who had their retirement programs approved on the ballot, embedded in their charter, as Glendale does, were eligible to continue an override tax to Proposition 13 to pay for retirement costs. The Glendale City Council made a decision that we weren't going to do that. Subsequently, there was legislation that forever prevented cities that had charter approval for the retirement override costs. Legislation was passed that prevented cities from ever doing that. So if you didn't do it prior to a certain date, you forever lost the ability to do it. Glendale City Council made a conscious decision we weren't going to do that. Things like business license taxes, which I defy anybody to find a community our size in Southern California that doesn't have one and uses those resources to support the general fund. This City Council has consistently made a decision we are not going to have one. Proposition 218 passed. Now you can't implement that legislatively. It has to go on the ballot, and in most cases would require a 2/3 vote. So decisions made historically have put us in the position that we're in today. As a result, we rely more heavily than many communities on our transfer from the utility fund. And in a downturn like we're facing now, everything suffers because the resources are limited, the resources go down, the costs generally don't react as quickly to that, and you're put in a position of having to make critical policy decisions balancing capital improvements with services. Now, Mr. Milano likes to term that as more money for compensation and benefits, which somehow sounds bad, but it's really about police on the street, hours in the library, amount of streets you're going to pave. That's the balancing that you do. It's not about what you're going to pay people or their benefits. It's about services to the public. And this city has always strived to be at the average, competitive wages and benefits, and we're not at the top of the heap, whether my salary or the police officer on the street. Take a survey, take a broad survey of Southern California communities, and we're not at the top. We're lucky to be a little bit above the average, in some cases below the average. You pay competitive wages, you have paid competitive wages, and we attract quality people for that. Right now, with resources constrained, there's pressure on all of these areas, and it makes your decisions that much more difficult. Nobody wants to see potholes in our streets. The reality is we haven't had enough funding to fund streets the level Streeter would like for many, many years, and I don't know a community that does, but Glendale does a relatively good job. That's having pressure. Our capital improvements are having pressure. The parks that we're going to open, like the Adult Recreation Center, that's going to put pressure on the general fund, because that's going to cost us more to operate that facility than we currently have in the general fund. But we'll manage that. We'll find a way through it. And the years ahead, as the economy comes back, I think we will have built capacity in both the CIP as well as the operating budget. And either you or councils that follow you will be able to make policy decisions about what you begin to restore. We've been there before in years past, and we'll likely be there again in subsequent city councils and city managers and staff after us.
Mr. Quintero.
Yeah, I'd like to also talk a little bit about reality of what Glendale was like up until the mid-1970s. When you looked and drove through the southern portions of the city, for the most part, you had single-family homes. You might have a couple of duplexes. You had some older style apartment buildings and a fairly low population rate, maybe in the 160 whatever range. But starting in the late 1970s and for the next decade, the city council allowed over 40,000 people to move into this city in the form of Soviet-style apartment blocks. So all of those single-family neighborhoods in the southern portion of the city that were nice little craftsman homes and Spanish-style homes, California bungalows, etc., were basically devastated, and in their place came these Soviet-style apartments. Built right to the property line, subterranean parking, et cetera, et cetera. Well, what came with that? Like I say, 40,000 people. That's generally more than a city like Duarte or entire cities in the San Gabriel Valley. That's the kind of population rise that took place in the city of Glendale. And with that came pressure on the schools, pressure on the libraries, pressure on the police, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So those previous city councils, in my opinion, changed Glendale forever. Eventually, it went past South Glendale, south of the 134, and moved into the northwest, and also heavy building up in the north and in Montrose. So when I hear about what we did 10 or whatever, 20 years ago as a city council, when I hear city council members talking about what we did and how we did this or did the other, so what? So what? You contributed to all of the issues that we have in Glendale right now. So that's a reality. And then what gets me is those same property owners that own these Soviet-style apartment buildings are constantly complaining about this, complaining about the other. Well, hey, you participated in the boom. You participated in making money off of this situation. Don't lecture me about something that you got involved in and made lots of money in your investment. So anyway, I've been hearing it for a long time, and I just always get a kick how easy it is to talk about the old days when you were one of the people that contributed to changing Glendale forever. And it's too late now. All we can hope to do now is the mini parks, working with the school district to try to put together multi-use activity centers for soccer, et cetera, but it's too late now. Glendale was overdone way before any of us got on the city council. So that's it.
Okay, thank you for that historical perspective. Any other comments? I can't disagree with your perspective, but I guess the question is that the best we can hope for? Is just to do mini parks and try and keep keep the status quo?
No, I think the key is the school district opening up their different schools. Roosevelt will do Columbus, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, and of course Pacific Edison. That's the only hope for recreational activities for youth.
Mr. Draymond?
Well, yeah, that, I think whether that's the best we can do or not, I think is a different story, different question. But in terms of the issue of joint use with the schools and their facilities, it's great to say, throw the gates open, let's make these facilities available. But when the school district comes back and says, fine, we'll do that, but who's going to share in the cost of the maintenance? Who's going to share in the cost of the cleanup at the end of the weekend so we prepare to turn it back into a school for the week? Who's going to share in the cost of the liability? We throw the gates open. Uniformly, the city says, you are. And they say, no, we're not, because they have their own budget issues. So it's more than just saying they should do that. Unless we're prepared to also talk about those issues, work those issues out, then that simply just isn't going to happen on any large-scale basis. The other thing, I sort of think of Mr. Starber as more as Daddy Warbucks than...
or a Goldfinger?
Yes, than a Goldfinger. I don't know. But in any case, no, seriously, the other thing, we talk about the huge purchases of open space. And as someone who was not on the council during that time, the purchase of open space is absolutely wonderful. But we also saw, let's also be very honest, we saw a situation where even members of the council at the time were injecting themselves into the deal-making, driving up the price of that open space. And although we eventually purchased a lot of that open space, unless the city was prepared to buy helicopters to parachute our citizens in for picnics and then pick them back up, that open space is completely unusable for our residents. It's not to say it doesn't have a value, it does. But when we're talking about open space, let's also be clear as to what kind of open space we're talking about. We're not talking about a park. We're talking about, well, how many of you have taken your families off to a nice, lovely afternoon picnic in Flint Canyon lately? Let's see, or Polson, or Murchison. You know, millions and millions and millions of dollars, some of which were unnecessary because of the deals that individual city council members injected themselves into to drive the price of those purchases up. And those monies didn't go into parks, usable parks. No, they did not.
Well, I don't want to get into that necessarily. A lot of that was in closed session discussions.
Well, I wasn't a part of this city at the time,
I know.
So I'm not breaching anything out of closed session.
I understand, John. I don't want to go there. The only thing I was going to comment on what Frank said, all that housing stock is now 40 years old, and it's not going to last forever. It might be 20, 30 more years yet, and it's all going to get torn down. There will be some council sitting here 20, 30 years from now looking at a rundown southern Glendale that they're going to have to put together new policies, new directions, and how do they reinvigorate this whole area? Tear it all down, rezone it, combine areas, because the housing stock won't be worth renovating. Since I went to USC, I always know the story about how the area around USC, that was the place to live back at the turn of the century, 100 years ago. All the rich lived there, whatever. And then it was neglected over a period of 70, 80 years and got totally run down. Then people like schools like USC have come in and started to reinvigorate the area, and it's coming back. We're going to have that problem in South Glendale. Not while any of us are sitting here, but some council's going to have it and have to deal with the problems they have down there. I know we've spent, must be near $40 million in South Glendale now, and you can't see it necessarily on the surface other than the parks, but the infrastructure, a lot has been spent down there, but there's just so much you can do. You can't do anything about the private property. You can't stop people from loading up their garages and parking on the streets and in the driveways, shortage of parking, streets that are too narrow. by old codes that were fine, but now you got log jams down there. What are you going to do? Nothing until the housing stock eventually has to be replaced. Thank you. At least that's my opinion.
Well, perhaps this is a discussion we can have at a later time when we talk about strategies and long-term planning for where we are and where we want to go. But clearly, I think we all recognize the challenges that we face. Okay, are there any other, Ms. Friedman?
One thing, and I don't think this was the right place for it. It was something that Mr. Milano said that made me think it would be a good idea, and maybe it's coming forward when the departments come in, is a list of sort of unfunded, high priority or unfunded wish list projects, so we can see what, kind of have that menu, thinking as we think about some of these funds going into the future, what's out there that we need to, be aware of. That would be one thing. I agree with a lot of what's been said. I do think that this city's been really trying to do a lot, particularly to the south part of the city. But when you talk about putting in large parks down there, we can't forget that that means removing housing. And I think if you asked most of the people who live there, really go and talk to the people, as I have, they're, as much as parks would be great, what they really want is high-quality housing. That's really what people want. They want more affordable housing. They want higher quality housing. And that's something that we've also been trying to do. And I think we also need to keep in mind that when we build housing today, because of a lot of the types of apartments that were built back in the 70s and 80s, we now do have much stricter standards in terms of open space and how those projects are designed, which makes a big difference in how people live. So when those old Soviet-style apartment buildings are torn down, they can't be built the same way now. They have to have an open space element. They have to have some green space. I've been advocating for a long time to take another look at our multifamily housing guidelines to be sure that that open space is really usable and does include real green elements. And I think we need to do that at some point, because we can't always assume that the Design Review Board is going to be the ones to make sure that happens. So I'd like to see that happen as we move forward. I know that planning has an awful lot on their plate, and it seems like every time any group of us meets, they end up with more. But at some point, I think that we should have some of those standards really codified so that the builders and the designers know as they're going in what to expect. But I think that does help. We are working on the Maryland Mini Park. We have to continue to keep an eye open in this downturn for opportunity sites. And that's going to be the challenge, is finding the money so that if a large piece of property does open up, can it become a park? And that's going to be very difficult to do. But I think that we've asked staff to let us know about those parcels. I haven't seen it come back to us in a little while, but I know at one point we had asked, when things come up for sale, have parks evaluated for whether for a mini park or for a larger park or a community garden. Let us know. Give us that opportunity while people are being foreclosed on or people are trying to get out from properties. Maybe this is a time to try to find some of that. But I think in terms of the sources of funding, we do have to talk about some of these sources that have been taboo in the past. And we should at some point have that conversation. So, like you said, there's no revelations in this part of the budget. I will say that I think our roads, compared to a lot of cities, I know that they're better or just as good. I don't need a report to tell me that. I bike on these roads. When there's potholes, I see them. And I can tell you that Adams, for instance, does need to be repaired. I was on there the other day, and it was, it had some potholes. But I ride a lot on our major roads and a lot of our back streets, and they're really not that bad. I went on Sunset Boulevard recently. Oh my God! I'm in an SUV, and I was almost bottoming out. So if I had to pick between doing a Maryland mini park and all of a sudden dumping millions and millions of dollars into road repair, I'd go for the mini park personally. But, I know we also have to find that balance. So I want to thank staff for coming in with this, and we've got a lot more of this to go. So for people that are watching at home, this is just the beginning of this process. Thank you very much.
Very good point, Ms. Friedman. Mr. Draymond.
I just wanted to just to ask. I assume somewhere, I know Mr. Hagani is here, somewhere, and Mr. Lanzafame both are here. Somewhere in the near future, I hope we are going to hear about this reworking, the potential for reworking the public art issue, so that this funding, rather than going into necessarily a metal teaspoon on the corner with a cherry in it, funds that actually can benefit the city in terms of public art space. For example, it could provide some relief in our funding for things like revamp of galleries at the Brand Library, or revamp of a very tired civic auditorium, or a creation of a civic gallery, and some of those things that are available to the Alex Theater, another, that could offset some of those expenses. I know that there's been others on the council have agreed with me to agendize that. I just want to make sure that is coming.
Thank you. Ms. Friedman.
Yeah, just one last thing that bears pointing out. I go not a lot, but I go as our representative to the California League of Cities, so I have a chance to talk to other elected officials, and people always ask, it's always the first question these days, how's your budget? They don't even say hello, it's just, how are things in Glendale, how's your budget? And I can tell you that, not that, it's all about comparisons, but compared to other cities, we are in amazingly good shape. I mean, people out there are sort of shocked that we are not going bankrupt like a lot of cities are, that we're not laying off half our police force like a lot of cities are, that we can do road repairs at all, that we can build anything. These are really extraordinary times. People know that just watching their own finances, and it's no different at the city level. And I think over the next few years, we're going to have to be very conservative, and some of the wish list projects will be put off. As much as we'd like to buy, 20 acres in South Glendale and put in, 10 soccer fields, it's not going to happen right now. But given that, we will go through this still being able to maintain the projects that we have and providing services for the community. And given the economy today, that's saying a lot, because a lot of cities can't even do that. And the state is having trouble even doing that. So I feel very proud that this city, under the direction of our highly paid city manager, has
would be Daddy Warbucks.
Daddy Warbucks, yes. Has been able to get us through this as well as they have. Thank you.
Mr. Quintero.
Yeah, Mr. Najarian, actually, Mayor Najarian, on Thursday evening, I was in Long Beach at a League of Cities function and talking to all of the elected officials that were there, and it's just as Ms. Friedman describes. I mean, they talked about they talked about projects that they had spoken about in the past that were on the verge of shovel-ready projects that were going to take place in their city. And one after the other, oh, no, that never worked out, this didn't work out, yeah, we're having layoffs, no, we closed the pool, no, the park department has been decimated, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, that's a fact compared to other cities. And not all of these cities are small cities, and they actually was a group of people from Northern and Central California as well as Southern California. And they're all in the same boat, so I think we're in fairly decent shape compared to other cities.
Thank you. Mr. Draymond.
Well, and you know what, it's important, I think, not just for us, but for the public as well, to understand that it's not a matter of this council sitting up here patting ourselves or our colleagues in the back, simply saying, oh, great job, great job. The issues are real, and this recession is a cruel national recession. It's hitting people in a lot of ways that we think about but don't necessarily even have the opportunity to talk about sometimes up here. And a lot of it's far, far, far beyond our capacity to do anything about on a local level. But having said that, it sort of brings us full circle. Something that was said earlier. The city has a history of not only being, shall we say, not financially impulsive. We don't have a history of being financially impulsive or fiscally impulsive in the city. However, one of the reasons that we're in the condition that Ms. Friedman mentions, Mr. Quintero mentions, et cetera, is because of the city personnel, the city staff, the city employees, the fact that this city has always been able to do more with less. And we've been doing that for some time. Now, that may be unpopular right now because a lot of people in this recession, folks sitting at home whose pocketbooks are hurting, are saying, hey, just fire those people. Hey, just slash the salaries. It isn't so simple as that, because a lot of the things we call quality of life go directly back to those feet on the ground. It never ceases to amaze me when I'm reminded of the fact, Mr. Mayor, that for the majority of the residents of this city, their view of how their city works is more highly represented by the guy changing the street light in front of their house than it is anything that any of us are doing. Most people in our city can't even name who their 5 council members are. But they do recognize that fellow or that gal in the city of Glendale truck that pulls up and takes care of some element that relates directly to their quality of life. Changing that street light, fixing that curb or that sidewalk that's caused somebody to have a trip, or the myriad of things that we do on a maintenance level every single day, our public safety assets, and so on. The quality of life of this city is key to having tremendous employees, and it's not just, and then again, that may be unpopular to say, it's not a love fest, quite obviously. If you pick up the paper, you see that isn't always the case. But it does bring us full circle to a comment that was made by the city manager when we were getting started with this discussion this morning. We sometimes talk about monies that go into the salaries as though it's some horrific, awful thing that cities do. And quite frankly, it is the bulk of the finances of just about every city. So, or let me say just about any city that is worth living in. Put it that way. By the way, Ms. Friedman, when I travel, I go down to, say, to Langer's to have a pastrami sandwich on 7th and Alvarado and look at the streets there. My God, you could kill yourself just falling into a pothole on foot, let alone on a bicycle or a car. So,
wait a minute. Let me just clear things up.
Go right ahead.
Don't go into central Los Angeles. Just go to Tujunga or Sunland, and that will give you a real good feel for what the CIP is like in the city of L.A., and especially Tujunga. Turn off Foothill and drive up into some of those residential neighborhoods. That'll give you a real good feel for how well L.A. is doing.
Thank you, Mr. Quintero.
That's for residents of L.A. that are complaining about Glendale.
And I guess that perhaps this is the last comment, but a thought that crossed my mind is so much of our efforts as council members are consumed in the day-to-day and the week-to-week workings of the city, and we oftentimes lose that perspective, the future outlook, and perhaps understanding the historical perspective of where we've come, where we want to be. A couple items mentioned by Ms. Friedman, Mr. Draymond, actually everyone on the dais, I think are very important comments. And once we get through this budget process, I'd like to have a chance, without the burden of the day-to-day issues, sit down and talk about perspective and some strategic planning as to where we want to go. Do we want to seek to lower density in any areas? Do we want to increase CIP payments, paving of the roadways? And every department has its own particular issues. So once this whole budget issue is done, I think there's a lot of ideas that are bubbling up through this budget process that we've got to get out, and some ideas may be very well taken, some might be not so well, but maybe with some input from the public we can set a course for decades to come, and maybe we'll be the council that turn the direction of the city. And Mr. Quintero, when you're 85, 90 years old with your own talk show, the young
From Spain.
from Spain.
Yes.
The young whippersnappers sitting at these at the dais won't be able to criticize as much, and they'll maybe point to great ideas, the Quintero plan towards turning the city around. All right, I think that's probably it for today. If there's any last comments, there's a motion to adjourn.
Move we adjourn.
Second.
Thank you. We're adjourned.
Thanks for your time.